And now, aviation weather around Alaska. Hello, I'm National Weather Service meteorologist Peter Chan with your Alaska aviation weather outlook for this first day of February 2024. Now, starting out, we have, as of this Thursday, high pressure over the Alaska mainland centered here. Bitter cold temperatures. We have extreme cold. There have been temperatures this Thursday morning as cold as 50 below or colder Fahrenheit for areas along the Yukon Valley, including Haisley, Tanana, on up through Fort Yukon. And this cold will continue here through the end of the week into the early weekend. The high pressure center will be shifting eastward across the Yukon and be sitting there by Sunday. In the meantime, weather system that's impacted the Panhandle with some moderate to heavy snow, that will be exiting outward later this Thursday into early Friday. We have a series of lows that are going to start to come up from the North Pacific and through the Bering and then up into the Gulf as we go through the weekend and into next week. The pattern storm track shifting and becoming more progressive. There'll be a wave train of low pressures attempting to affect areas of the Bering on into the Gulf as we go through next week. First hint of that, though, is a low that's sitting out here in the far western Bering, a front out ahead of it. There'll be some secondary development along this front that'll push a low up into the western Gulf here early in the weekend. But otherwise, VFR conditions across the mainland, bitterly cold temperatures. There could be some patchy low stratus ice fog in some of the valleys where temperature inversion is very low. And we also have just very cold temperatures, very shallow. And then as we go through Friday afternoon, extensive VFR across the mainland, improving conditions, VFR across the Panhandle, back to the west, leading front coming into the southwest coast, coming up through Kodiak Island, another low center affecting areas of the Aleutians lower Bering. Saturday morning, we do have some IFR along the Arctic coast, Utqiagvik down toward Kaktovik, and then south into maybe the upper Porcupine River. As we get down here through the Gulf, we do see some areas of IFR, Yakutat Bay on out into the northern and then lower central Gulf. Also, more IFR across the central Bering into the central Aleutians. And for Saturday afternoon, we see this front. Secondary development will be down here into the southwest Gulf. IFR conditions across the southwest, the Kuskokwim, Bristol Bay area, and Kodiak Island. Also, IFR conditions will be increasing across the Arctic coast and north slope. We still have some gusty winds that could cause areas of blowing and drifty snow up there. So the passes generally across the state on Friday. VFR conditions there through the east central Brooks Range at Anatuvik and Adigan passes. As we go down the west arm of the Alaskan Range, Lake Clark and Merrill, VFR conditions. But as you get toward Cook Inlet, around and near the shoreline areas of the inlet, you could see low stratus, some ice fog there. And coming up along Rainy Pass to Windy Pass, VFR, and then further east, Isabel and Mentasta, we expect VFR conditions with that high pressure continuing to hold across the central mainland. And as I mentioned, that high will be slipping eastward into the Yukon by Sunday. Tanita, look for VFR conditions across the Copper River Valley, and as we drop down toward Portage Pass, VFR conditions as well. And in the far north end of the Panhandle, Chilkoot and White will see VFR conditions, and we expect those VFR conditions to be increasing across the Panhandle there on Friday. Looking at freezing levels, the surface freezing line runs up into the central Bering between St. Paul, St. Matthew, and then drops down across the central Alaska Peninsula along the coastline of Kodiak Island across the lower Gulf into the southern Panhandle. Freezing levels aloft, 2,000 and 4,000 feet. You have to get out toward British Columbia and off of Haida Gwaii and Vancouver Island. Otherwise, not a lot of warmer air. There is some milder air trying to push northward as we go into Friday afternoon with the frontal system and the series of lows that will be coming out of the North Pacific, moving into the Bering, and eventually, as we get into next week, up into the Gulf. We do anticipate, though, along these frontal boundaries to the west, there could be some moderate icing Friday across a good portion of the Bering Sea and along the Aleutians, nudging upwards towards the Alaska Peninsula, generally above 3,000 feet, and then above 5,000 feet along the Aleutians. Back toward the lower panhandle, there could be some moderate icing above 3,000 feet there in the lower southeast corner of the panhandle toward height. Or otherwise, looking at winds aloft 30,000 feet, we find broad northwesterly winds across the mainland, strongest over the Gulf at about 65 to 70 knots. And then we have a core of 95 knot winds coming up into the central Aleutians. At 9,000 feet, 700 millibars, we anticipate winds strongest out over the lower Gulf and off of Haida Gwaii, 50 to 65 knots. And then back here to the west, we have southerly winds with this, again, kind of the overall push of weather systems coming out of the North Pacific here, southwest of the Aleutians. Belts of winds 40 to near 60 knots, and 3,000 feet. Pretty calm conditions as would be expected with the high pressure, bitter cold air over the mainland. Lower Gulf, west-northwest winds 30, 40 knots tops. But here, the belt of stronger winds with the frontal system extend from the central Bering down across the central eastern Aleutians. Winds could be as high as 50 to 70 knots, just 3,000 feet above the surface. As a result, we expect there could be some severe turbulence, surface to 4,000 feet, especially here the central into the eastern Aleutians on Friday. Also moderate turbulence extending further north up there around the Pribilof Islands, St. Matthew up to the southwest side there of St. Lawrence Island. There could be a little pocket of moderate turbulence there just outside the entrance of Cook Inlet, and then just some isolated turbulence along the southwest coast of the Panhandle, surface to 6,000 feet.